Welcome back, everyone. So this is going to be the video that is the second half of our discussion about materials and textures. So this video will focus on textures. Textures go a little bit beyond what a material does, insofar as textures give a little bit more detail to our object. They also allow our object to appear more three-dimensional. And we're going to discuss a little bit about how that works. But first, there's something very important that a lot of students tend to overlook when we first start working with textures. And that is that textures go on top of material. So an object has to have a material for a texture to work. If we don't add a material, then any texture work we do won't matter. It won't stick. So I'm going to go ahead and add a new material to our cube. You can see I've got a cube here. Right now it's got no material on it. It's very important that I add the material first. If I miss this step, then my texture won't show up when I try to render my object. So I'm going to create a material, which we've got here. And now that I've got my material, I'm going to look for a different button on the button bar. And on the button bar, I want to find, I got to zoom out a little bit so we can see it a little better. I want to find the button that looks like a checkerboard. So our materials are the circle with the checker pattern. Our texture button is the actual checkerboard looking button. And here you can see that I have no textures on my material yet, but because I've added a material, I can go ahead and create a new texture. There are a bunch of different texture types in Blender, and each type adds a unique pattern to our mesh. If we take a look here, we have a whole bunch from wood to something called Voronoi to point density, Stucky, ocean, noise, Musgrave, marble, magic, clouds. There's all kinds of different textures that we can use, and each one of these textures comes with their own settings. So each of these textures are unique. I'm going to start with wood. What I say by each texture being unique, or what I mean by that, is that first of all, the pattern will be different. So right here we can see some diagonal lines that are cutting through our object. This is what our texture is going to look like. If I were to go to, let's say, Stucky, it's a completely different texture. It looks like little white noise in here, or little static. And so each different texture has a different pattern. There are also different settings based on the texture that you pick. So right here, you can see that I have a section called wood. All of these sections under wood are unique to the wood texture. If I change this to ocean, then the ocean tab appears. So the tab matches whatever the name. If I go to magic, it turns into magic. See that there? So I have a whole bunch of texture-specific settings that I can use. With wood, it basically lets me change what my stripes look like. So here I have for wood, sign, saw, and try. And these are just different patterns that are built into Blender that allow Blender to generate different wood-like textures. So let's see what one of these looks like by default. If I render, I can see that not only do I get lines that are sort of weird crisscrossing each other, right? These look like they're going in the wrong direction. I want them to go in the same direction. I also get pink. So let's see if we can track down why I'm getting a weird pink texture. Down here at the bottom, just like with material, we can change the color of our texture. So this down here is called the influence color. So notice that I have a whole tab here called influence. Influence controls how my texture affects the mesh. So if I don't want pink, if I'm making a wood texture, I probably want something closer to brown. So I'm going to get something a little more brown for my texture. Now, if I try to render, I have brown lines. But the material of my texture still looks pretty bad, right? Like this white with brown doesn't look quite right. And part of the reason for that is because we've got stripes going this way, and then we've got stripes going straight vertically. So the stripes don't match up. So let's take a look at another setting. So far we know that for textures, we have the type settings like wood, which change the pattern. We have color settings under influence. Now we're going to talk about something called projection. Projections change how the texture is laid onto our shape. If we look under our mapping tab, we can see that our projection is flat. Flat is a problem. Because we're using a cube, a flat texture just tries to lay it over the top, almost like you're folding a piece of newspaper around this box. So if we look at it, it kind of looks like we're wrapping a present, right? Like someone folded this corner and someone folded this corner. That's because we're using a flat projection. So let's see what else we have for projections. We have a projection called sphere, tube, cube, and flat. We want to pick a projection that is the closest to the shape that we are texturing. In this case, I'm texturing a cube, so I have a perfect match. I can select cube, and everything should map fine. So now, if I render, and I need to change my coordinates as well. Change coordinates to generated. There we go. So what's happening here is the coordinate section determines how Blender calculates the projection. And for some reason, by default, Blender uses something called UV. UV is what we would use for a very complex form of image mapping. And we're not doing that. We're doing a very simple texture mapping. So for us, we just want to always have coordinates set to generated. Okay, so always look for this guy. And then the projection changes based on our shape. So let's see here. Coordinate should be generated, and then projections are tube, cube, sphere, and flat based on the textured shape. So because we want to wrap our texture around a cube, we want cube as our option. If we were trying to texture a sphere, we would do spheres. You guys have been working on a lighthouse. For something like the lighthouse, we would want tube because it forms a tube that rises straight up out of the ground. There's 4 different mappings here that are meant to help tell our mesh or our texture which way it should go. But now my colors still look pretty weird, right? My lines line up better, but my color still looks strange. So let's go to the Materials tab and change the diffuse color of our object. I'm also going to make this kind of yellow. I'm going to drop it down a little bit. So we end up with something that's going to be a little bit more wood-like. Okay, still doesn't really look like wood, but at least we're getting colors that make more sense, right? This box is starting to look like something. So we've covered our texture options, our texture mapping, and our texture color. But there's a couple other things we can do under influence that'll help us out. One of the big things is I had mentioned that textures can make our shape look more three-dimensional. To demonstrate this, I'm going to change my wood to be a saw pattern, like this. And also, because wood isn't, I don't want my wood to be very shiny, I'm going to go back to the materials and drop the specular intensity to 0.1. So remember, this guy controls how shiny our object is. I want my wood to be pretty dull. So I'm going to drop that to 0.1. I'm going to go back to my Textures tab, and now under Influence, I'm going to look for something called Geometry. So Geometry gives our texture 3 dimensions. So it makes our texture 3D. And we always want to use normal for the most part. You guys can experiment with other settings, and actually all of these settings down here will change a little bit the way that your texture looks. We already kind of understand what diffuse means and what specular means, so we can change how shiny our texture is. But geometry actually affects how rough and 3D our texture looks. So I'm going to check normal for geometry, and we're going to see how this changes our shape. So notice right now the texture looks very flat. If I re-render, the texture is actually getting a little bit more shading around the edges, and it's looking a little bit more 3D. Let me up our geometry a little bit, if it'll let me. Go all the way up to 5 for our normal and see what happens. Now we're getting a very three-dimensional object. So you can see these seams in the wood are cut deep now, and the wood kind of stands out from its from little creases in it. That's what normal is designed to do. To demonstrate this a little bit better, I'm going to drop this back to 1.0, so it's not quite as extreme, but this goes anywhere from 0 to 5. So normal geometry goes from 0 to 5. And the higher the geometry, the more 3D and warped our texture will look. To really show this off, I'm going to switch to Stucky. So Stucky is meant to be kind of a rough pattern. And if I use Stucky, you can see that we get this bubbly, almost dirt Minecraft shape. Now, the more I up my geometry, the more I increase this normal value, the bumpier my shape becomes. So geometry is controlling those little imperfections in our shape. And it's what allows us to start to morph and twist the shape a little bit more. If we wanted to, we could turn on a couple more here. We have one that is the amount of warp in our shape. So if we increase the amount of warp, we're going to get a very different texture. You can see that there are some extra creases being made here. I can also change the distortion. I'm going to drop normal a little bit. Change the distortion. So now we've got an object that is starting to flatten out, but otherwise isn't really doing a whole lot with the normal geometry because I dropped normal down. So in different ways, we're able to just have a cube with a texture on it, but the texture itself is changing the shape and the look and feel of our object. A lot of these I haven't even had time to play around with, and I would encourage you guys, try out different influences, see how it affects your object. But remember that normal geometry, just this one, is a great way to make your object pop a little bit more. It's a great way to throw a texture on the object and make it have that little bit of 3D roughness about it. In class, you guys are going to be using materials and textures to make 2 different chess pawns. And the shortcut you're going to want to remember for that is Shift D. So remember, we went over this in the last video. Write this shortcut down. Shift D is to duplicate. If I wanted to make another cube, I could do Shift D, and bam, I've got exactly the same cube. See that there? So Shift D is what we're going to be using to duplicate pawns in our next activity. We're going to put a material on one, and we're going to do some transparency. And then on the other pawn, we're going to use a different type of texture called marble to make it look like it's made out of stone. So we got a couple of different things that we're going to look at, and all of these things, diffuse color, specular intensity, texture color, texture type, all of these things are going to go into your next activity. So you want to make sure that you've reviewed this video and you've also reviewed the materials video. Thanks for watching.